Have you ever felt like a prisoner inside your own emotional landscape, watching yourself react to situations in ways you later regret, feeling powerless as waves of anger, fear, jealousy, or despair wash over your being and dictate your actions, as if some invisible force within you holds more authority over your life than your conscious will? This internal war between what you know you should do and what your emotions compel you to do is perhaps the most ancient and universal struggle of human consciousness, a battle that every spiritual seeker must eventually confront if they are to advance beyond the ordinary realm of existence into the extraordinary territories of awakened awareness. Manlypalmerhall, that great philosopher and interpreter of the mystery traditions, understood this fundamental truth with crystalline clarity. Emotional control is not merely a helpful skill for navigating daily life, but the very first weapon that must be forged and mastered by anyone who aspires to walk the path of the initiated. For without this foundational mastery, all other spiritual achievements remain forever out of reach, like stars visible in the night sky but impossible to grasp. The ancient mystery schools of Egypt, Greece, India, and Tibet all recognize this essential principle, placing emotional discipline at the very threshold of their sacred teachings, understanding that a person ruled by their emotional nature is no more prepared for higher wisdom than a child is prepared to command an army. Today we will explore why this mastery represents the cornerstone of all esoteric development, how the great sages and mystics of history approached this challenge, and most importantly, how you can begin to reclaim sovereignty over your own inner world, transforming from a servant of reactive impulses into a conscious architect of your own experience. The first thing we must understand about emotions is their fundamental nature within the structure of human consciousness. According to the perennial wisdom traditions, emotions are not merely random feelings that arise without cause or purpose, but rather, they represent powerful energetic forces that connect our immortal spiritual essence with the temporary vehicle of the physical body. Think of emotions as the language through which your animal nature communicates, a primal system of signals that evolved over millions of years to ensure survival in a dangerous world where threats could emerge from any direction at any moment. When our ancestors walked the earth thousands of years ago, fear triggered the immediate response needed to escape predators. Anger provided the explosive energy required to defend territory and resources. Desire motivated the pursuit of food and reproduction, and these emotional mechanisms served their purpose perfectly within that primitive context. However, as human consciousness evolved and our external circumstances changed dramatically, these same emotional patterns persisted within our psyche, continuing to activate with the same intensity they possessed when our survival depended entirely upon instantaneous reactions. The problem that every spiritual aspirant must eventually confront is that these ancient emotional programs, while once necessary for physical survival, now create tremendous obstacles to spiritual development because they keep consciousness anchored in the reactive animal dimension of existence rather than allowing it to ascend into the higher realms of reasoned wisdom and intuitive understanding. The initiated person recognizes that emotional reactions, left unchecked and unexamined, essentially place the most primitive aspect of our being in control of the entire vehicle, much like allowing a frightened horse to determine the direction and speed of the carriage it pulls, regardless of where the driver actually intends to go. Hall teaches us that the ancient mystery schools understood emotions as forces belonging to what they called the lunar, or watery dimension of consciousness, ever-changing, reflecting external circumstances, waxing and waning according to influences beyond rational control. The moon in esoteric symbolism represents the realm of emotion, instinct, memory, and subconscious patterns, constantly shifting through phases, never maintaining a stable form, pulling the tides of human feeling back and forth with invisible gravitational power. In contrast, the solar dimension represents the awakened intellect, the discriminating mind, the conscious will that can observe these emotional tides without being swept away by them, maintaining a stable center regardless of external storms. The person who lives entirely within the lunar consciousness is like a ship without anchor or rudder, tossed about by every wave of feeling that passes through their experience, completely at the mercy of circumstances and the emotional reactions those circumstances trigger. The initiate, however, gradually develops solar consciousness, learning to witness the arising of emotional patterns without immediately identifying with them or allowing them to dictate action. creating a space of awareness between stimulus and response where conscious choice becomes possible. This is what Hall means when he speaks of emotional control as the first weapon, because without establishing this observing awareness, without creating this internal distance between the witnessing consciousness and the observed emotional content, no real spiritual progress can occur, since you remain completely fused with and identified as your emotional reactions, rather than recognizing yourself as the conscious presence that experiences these reactions. Consider the story told in certain Sufi traditions of the master who accepted a new student known throughout the village for his terrible temper and violent outbursts. The other students wondered why the teacher would accept such a person, someone so obviously unprepared for spiritual training. For an entire year, the master gave this student only one instruction. Whenever anger arose within him, he was to simply observe it, to notice the physical sensations in his body, the thoughts that accompanied the anger, the urge to act on the feeling. But he was not to express the anger outwardly or suppress it forcefully, merely to witness it with full attention, as if he were a scientist studying a fascinating natural phenomenon. The student found this practice almost unbearably difficult at first, as his entire life had been lived in immediate reaction to every angry impulse, and now he was being asked to create a gap between the feeling and the action, to remain present with the uncomfortable energy of anger, without either venting it or pushing it away. Months passed, and gradually something remarkable began to happen. The student noticed that when he observed his anger with full attention instead of immediately reacting to it, the anger would arise, reach a peak of intensity, and then naturally begin to dissipate on its own, like a wave that crashes upon the shore and then recedes back into the ocean. He discovered that emotions, no matter how powerful they seemed in the moment, were actually temporary energetic events rather than permanent states of being, and that by simply maintaining conscious awareness without reacting, he could allow them to move through his experience and release themselves naturally. After a full year of this practice, the student returned to the master and reported his discovery, and the teacher smiled and said, "Now you have forged your first weapon. Now you are ready to begin the real work, because you have learned that you are not your emotions. You are the awareness that experiences emotions, and this recognition changes everything." This brings us to the second crucial understanding about emotional control in the initiatic path. Most people misunderstand what emotional mastery actually means, believing it requires the complete suppression or elimination of all emotional experience, turning themselves into cold, unfeeling automatons who move through life with mechanical detachment. This could not be further from the truth of what the wisdom traditions teach. Hall and other authentic teachers of the mysteries make it very clear that the goal is not to destroy or deny the emotional nature, but rather to bring it under the conscious direction of the awakened will, to transform it from master into servant, from dictator into advisor. Emotions contain powerful information about our environment, our relationships, our inner state, and when properly understood and channeled, they become valuable tools for navigating life rather than obstacles to overcome. The difference between the emotional person and the emotionally mature initiate is not that one has feelings and the other does not, but rather that the initiate has developed the capacity to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to feel deeply without losing their center, to allow emotional energy to flow through their being without that energy dictating their thoughts, words, or actions. Think of it like the difference between a person who is swept away by a river current and a skilled swimmer who can move through the same current while maintaining control of their direction, using the power of the water to assist their movement, rather than fighting against it or being carried helplessly wherever the current leads. The ancient alchemical traditions, which Hall studied so extensively, encoded these teachings about emotional transformation in their symbolic language of turning lead into gold. The lead represents the crude, reactive emotional nature that most people possess. Heavy, dark, easily melted and shaped by external heat or pressure, fundamentally unstable in its form. The gold represents the purified emotional nature of the adept, stable, radiant, beautiful, incorruptible by external influences, maintaining its essential nature regardless of circumstances. The alchemical process itself describes the stages of inner work required to accomplish this transformation. The initial confrontation with your shadow material, the breaking down of old patterns through conscious awareness, the purification through the fire of sustained attention and self-knowledge, and finally the emergence of the refined essence, the gold of emotional wisdom. Each stage of this process requires tremendous courage and persistence, because you are essentially dismantling the automatic response patterns that have governed your behavior for your entire life, patterns that feel like they are who you are, and replacing them with conscious, chosen responses that align with your higher understanding, rather than your primitive reactivity. This is why the mystery schools always placed emotional control as the foundation, the first weapon that must be mastered, because without completing this fundamental work, attempting more advanced practices is like trying to build a temple on quicksand, doomed to collapse under its own weight.
Neste momento, quero fazer uma pausa e perguntar: você já se sentiu completamente dominado por uma emoção, observando a si mesmo dizer ou fazer coisas que sua sabedoria interior sabia serem destrutivas, mas sentindo-se incapaz de parar, como se algo dentro de você tivesse assumido o controle total? Essa sensação de ser espectador da própria vida emocional, sem poder real sobre suas reações, é algo que quase todos nós experimentamos em momentos de grande intensidade.
Se você reconhece essa batalha interior, se você sente que está pronto para começar a forjar sua primeira arma como buscador espiritual, compartilhe nos comentários apenas escrevendo: "Estou pronto para o controle", para que outros caminhantes nesta jornada saibam que não estão sozinhos nessa luta fundamental. Às vezes, o simples ato de reconhecer onde estamos e declarar nossa intenção de mudar já inicia o processo de transformação alquímica dentro de nós. Seu comentário pode inspirar alguém que está silenciosamente lutando com as mesmas questões. Alguém que precisa ver que outras pessoas também estão comprometidas com esse trabalho interior. Agradeço sua coragem de se manifestar, de reconhecer publicamente seu compromisso com o caminho do despertar. Now, how does one actually begin this work of emotional control in practical terms? The mystery traditions offer several foundational practices that have been tested and refined over thousands of years. The first and most essential practice is what we might call conscious observation, or mindful witnessing of your emotional landscape. This means developing the habit of watching your emotional reactions as they arise, noticing them with the same objective attention you might give to clouds passing across the sky, or leaves blowing in the wind. When anger arises, instead of immediately justifying it or acting on it, you pause and internally note, "Interesting. Anger is present right now. I can feel it in my chest, in my jaw, in my rapid thoughts, seeking to blame someone or something for this discomfort." When fear appears, rather than being instantly consumed by it, you observe, "Fear has arisen. I notice tightness in my stomach, racing thoughts about potential dangers, an urge to flee or avoid the situation." This practice of observation creates what the Buddhists call mindfulness, and what psychologists refer to as metacognition, essentially the ability to think about your thinking, to feel your feelings, while simultaneously maintaining a broader awareness that you are more than these temporary mental and emotional states. The key is to practice this observation without judgment, without labeling your emotions as good or bad, right or wrong, but simply noticing them with curiosity and acceptance, the way a naturalist might observe the behavior of animals in their habitat, seeking to understand rather than condemn. The second foundational practice involves what Hall and other esoteric teachers call the art of non-identification. This means consciously reminding yourself, repeatedly throughout each day, that you are not your emotions. You are the consciousness that experiences emotions. When you say, "I am angry," you have completely identified with the emotion, merged your sense of self with a temporary energetic state, and this identification gives that emotion total power over your being. But if you can shift your language and your internal perspective to, "I am experiencing anger," or "Anger is present in my awareness right now," you have created a subtle but profound separation between your essential self and the emotional weather passing through your inner sky. This shift may seem small, almost semantic, but its effects are revolutionary for your relationship with emotional experience. By practicing non-identification consistently, you gradually build what we might call psychological and spiritual muscle, the strength to remain centered in your observing awareness, even when powerful emotional storms rage through your system. Think of it like standing on solid ground watching a tornado pass by, versus being picked up and carried away by that tornado. The storm may be equally powerful in both cases, but your experience and outcome are completely different, depending on whether you maintain your ground or lose it. The third essential practice involves what the Stoic philosophers called the examination of impressions, or what modern psychology terms cognitive reframing. This practice recognizes that emotions do not arise simply from external events themselves, but from our interpretation of those events, the meaning we assign to circumstances, the stories we tell ourselves about what is happening, and what it means for our well-being. The ancient Stoic teacher Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of things, a profound insight that places tremendous power back in your hands. If someone insults you and you interpret their words as a devastating judgment of your worth, you will feel intense emotional pain. But if you interpret the same words as revealing the speaker's own inner turmoil and having nothing to do with your actual value, the emotional impact dissipates dramatically. The practice, then, involves carefully examining the interpretations and assumptions that generate your emotional reactions, questioning whether these interpretations are actually true or merely habitual patterns of thinking, considering alternative ways of viewing the situation that might be equally or more valid. This does not mean lying to yourself or engaging in false positive thinking, but rather, honestly investigating whether your emotional reactions are based on accurate perceptions of reality or on distorted, fear-based interpretations that you have carried since childhood. Hall emphasizes that in the ancient mystery schools, students would spend years working exclusively with these foundational practices before being introduced to more advanced, esoteric techniques, because the teachers understood that, without a stable emotional foundation, without the ability to maintain equilibrium in the face of life's inevitable challenges, pursuing higher spiritual states would be dangerous and counterproductive. Imagine attempting to climb a mountain in a severe storm, or trying to paint a delicate masterpiece while your hands are trembling violently. The circumstances make success virtually impossible. Similarly, attempting to access higher states of consciousness while your emotional body remains chaotic and reactive creates tremendous risk, because those expanded states will simply magnify whatever unresolved emotional patterns you carry, potentially leading to inflation, delusion, or psychological crisis rather than genuine spiritual awakening. This is why the authentic traditions always insist on this foundational work first, building a strong container capable of safely holding the powerful energies that advanced spiritual practice generates. Consider another teaching story from the Hermetic tradition about a young seeker who came to an aged adept, requesting to be taught the secrets of magic and mystical power. The old master looked at the eager young person and asked a simple question: "Can you sit in silence and observe your own mind for 1 hour without being carried away by your thoughts and feelings?" The student confidently replied that such a simple task would be no problem at all. Surely the real teachings would be far more complex and mysterious. The master smiled and invited the student to sit in meditation while the teacher went about other tasks, agreeing to return in 1 hour. The young seeker sat down, closed their eyes, and within moments discovered that sitting in simple awareness was far more difficult than anticipated, as thoughts and emotions arose in an endless stream, pulling attention in every direction, creating elaborate dramas and scenarios, generating physical discomfort that demanded to be addressed, producing boredom that became almost unbearable in its intensity. After what felt like many hours, though only 30 minutes had actually passed, the student gave up, opening their eyes and feeling quite humbled. When the master returned, the student admitted complete failure at this supposedly simple task, and the teacher nodded knowingly and said, "Now you understand why I cannot teach you magic and mysticism, because you have not yet developed the most basic tool required for such work, the ability to remain present with your own inner experience without being swept away by it. And until you develop this capacity through patient practice, any advanced teachings would be wasted on you, like trying to teach calculus to someone who has not yet learned to count." The student stayed with the master for 7 years, practicing only this foundational work of emotional and mental discipline, and only after demonstrating consistent mastery of their inner weather was the student finally initiated into the deeper mysteries. The ancient Egyptians, whose mystery schools profoundly influenced all later Western esoteric traditions, had a beautiful way of representing this teaching through their symbolism. In their temples and sacred texts, they depicted the human soul's journey through the underworld after death, facing a series of tests and challenges, with the ultimate judgment occurring in the Hall of Mot, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived with integrity, wisdom, and emotional balance. They would pass into eternal life. But if the heart was heavier, weighed down by unresolved emotions, fears, anger, and destructive patterns, it would be consumed by Amit, the devourer, and the soul would cease to exist. This was not merely a myth about literal events after physical death, but rather an encoded teaching about the spiritual death and rebirth that must occur during life for anyone who wishes to truly awaken. The heart represents the emotional nature, and the feather represents truth, wisdom, and the higher consciousness. The teaching is clear. Your emotional body must become so refined, so purified, so light, that it weighs no more than a feather, meaning it no longer pulls you down into reactive patterns, no longer anchors you to the lower dimensions of existence, allowing your consciousness to ascend into the higher realms of being. Jung, that great psychologist who deeply studied the mystery traditions and alchemy, understood this teaching and expressed it in modern psychological language through his concept of individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the psyche into a unified conscious whole. He recognized that most people spend their entire lives at the mercy of unconscious emotional complexes, automatic patterns formed in childhood that continue to run in the background of consciousness, hijacking the personality whenever certain triggers appear. These complexes, which Jung saw as semi-autonomous subpersonalities within the psyche, essentially function as emotional programs that take over the main operating system of consciousness whenever activated, producing behaviors and reactions that the person may later regret or even fail to recognize as their own. The work of individuation requires bringing these unconscious patterns into full conscious awareness, examining them, understanding their origins, and gradually integrating their energy in a healthy way, rather than remaining their unconscious servant. This is precisely the same work that the ancient mystery traditions described as emotional purification, or the alchemical transmutation of lead into gold, just expressed in the psychological terminology of the 20th century, rather than the symbolic language of ancient esoteric schools. What makes this work so challenging and why it requires such patience and persistence is that emotional patterns are not merely mental concepts or intellectual beliefs that can be changed through logical argument and new information. These patterns are encoded deep within the nervous system, stored as procedural memory in the body itself, wired into the neural pathways through thousands of repetitions over many years. When a certain trigger appears in your environment, your nervous system responds instantly, before conscious thought even has time to engage, activating the entire pattern of physiological arousal, emotional feeling, and behavioral impulse that has become associated with that trigger through past experience. This is why you can intellectually understand that your anger at a particular situation is disproportionate and unhelpful, yet still feel the anger arise with full force, still experience the urge to act on it despite your rational understanding. The pattern exists at a level deeper than rational thought, at the level of embodied habit, and changing it requires more than mental understanding. It requires patient retraining of the nervous system itself through consistent practice over time. This is where the great wisdom of the ancient practices reveals itself, because techniques like meditation, conscious breathing, mindful movement, and ritual were not invented arbitrarily or based on superstition, but rather developed through centuries of experimentation by people who were deeply observing the relationship between body, emotion, and consciousness. They discovered that by working directly with the breath, with physical posture, with sustained attention, they could gradually retrain the nervous system, creating new neural pathways, establishing new default responses, literally rewiring the biological substrate through which emotional patterns operate. Modern neuroscience has now confirmed what the mystics always knew, that the brain and nervous system possess remarkable plasticity, the ability to change and reorganize throughout life in response to sustained practice and attention. This means that no matter how deeply ingrained your emotional patterns may be, no matter how long you have been their servant, genuine transformation is possible through committed practice, though it requires the patience to work at the level of the nervous system, rather than expecting instant change through mere willpower or intellectual understanding. Hall points out that one of the great secrets taught in the mystery schools was the principle of sublimation, the art of redirecting emotional energy toward higher purposes, rather than simply suppressing or indulging it. Think of emotional energy as a kind of psychological electricity that can be channeled in many different directions depending on the structure of the circuit you create. If you simply suppress emotion, pushing it down and refusing to acknowledge it, you create tremendous internal pressure that will eventually explode or leak out in distorted ways. If you indulge every emotional impulse, immediately expressing whatever you feel, you remain at the mercy of your reactive nature, creating chaos in your life and relationships. But if you learn the art of sublimation, you can take that same emotional energy and redirect it toward creative expression, spiritual practice, service to others, or any constructive activity that transforms raw emotional force into refined accomplishment. The sexual energy, for instance, when sublimated through esoteric practices, becomes the fuel for profound spiritual experiences and creative genius, rather than remaining trapped in compulsive behavioral patterns. The anger energy, when properly channeled, becomes the fierce determination and courage needed to overcome obstacles and defend truth and justice. The fear energy, when transmuted, becomes the heightened awareness and sensitivity that allows you to navigate danger skillfully. Every emotion contains power, and the initiated person learns to work with that power consciously, rather than being victimized by it. Se você também busca compreender os mistérios do domínio emocional e deseja continuar esta jornada de autodescoberta e desenvolvimento da primeira arma do iniciado, este canal é um espaço dedicado a explorarmos juntos as verdades ancestrais que podem iluminar seu caminho interior. A cada semana, compartilhamos reflexões e ensinamentos práticos dos grandes mestres da tradição esotérica, incluindo manlypalmerhall, que tem ajudado inúmeras almas a encontrar equilíbrio em momentos de turbulência emocional. Inscreva-se para receber estes lembretes de sabedoria que podem ser exatamente o que sua consciência precisa para dar o próximo passo na jornada de despertar. Esta comunidade de buscadores da verdade está aqui para caminhar ao seu lado, oferecendo suporte, inspiração e conhecimento prático para o trabalho interior que todos devemos realizar. Agradeço profundamente por você ter dedicado seu tempo e atenção a este vídeo, e espero sinceramente poder continuar sendo parte da sua evolução espiritual e emocional. In conclusion, we return to where we began, to that fundamental recognition that emotional control is not merely one technique among many in the spiritual path, but rather the essential foundation upon which all other development must be built. Hall's teachings, drawing from thousands of years of mystery school wisdom, make this absolutely clear. You cannot access higher states of consciousness while remaining a slave to reactive emotional patterns. You cannot develop spiritual power while your inner world remains chaotic and ungoverned. You cannot become an initiated being while the most primitive aspect of your nature retains absolute authority over your thoughts, words, and actions. This is not a limitation imposed by some external authority or arbitrary rule, but rather a natural law of consciousness itself, as inevitable as the law of gravity in the physical realm. A house built on shifting sand will collapse, a plant without strong roots will be blown over by the first strong wind, and a spiritual seeker without emotional mastery will be swept away by the first major crisis or challenge that appears on their path. The ancient wisdom keepers understood this completely, and they structured their teachings accordingly, ensuring that students developed a strong foundation before attempting to build higher. The beautiful truth hidden within this teaching is that emotional mastery, while challenging, is entirely achievable for any sincere seeker willing to dedicate themselves to the practice. You do not need special gifts, mystical abilities, or perfect life circumstances to begin this work. You only need honesty about where you currently are, commitment to consistent practice, and patience with the gradual nature of real transformation. Every moment offers an opportunity to practice conscious observation rather than automatic reaction. Every emotional challenge becomes a training ground for developing your first weapon as an initiated being. When anger arises, you can practice witnessing it without identifying with it or acting on it, forging your sword of awareness in the fire of that difficult emotion. When fear appears, you can practice meeting it with curiosity rather than running from it or being paralyzed by it, strengthening your shield of presence. When desire pulls at you, you can practice observing that pull without immediately following it, developing the reins of self-governance that allow you to direct your energies consciously rather than being dragged wherever impulse leads. Each of these small moments of conscious practice repeated hundreds and thousands of times, gradually builds the capacity for emotional mastery that the mystery schools recognized as essential for all higher work. Remember that you are not alone in this struggle, that every genuine spiritual seeker throughout history has faced this same challenge, has wrestled with their own reactive nature, has felt overwhelmed by the power of their emotions, and wondered if they would ever achieve mastery over this turbulent inner realm. The great sages, saints, and mystics whose teachings inspire us were not born with perfect emotional control. They developed it through years of patient practice, through countless small failures and small victories, through the gradual accumulation of conscious moments until those conscious moments became their natural state of being. What they achieved is available to you as well, not because you are special or chosen, but because you are human. And this potential for transformation exists within every human consciousness as its birthright and natural possibility. The path is clear, the techniques are known. The only question is whether you will commit yourself to walking it, whether you will take up the challenge of forging your first weapon, whether you will begin today the work of reclaiming sovereignty over your own inner world, transforming from a servant of emotional reactivity into a conscious master of your own experience, taking your first real steps on the ancient path of the initiated.